Venezuela's coordinated the unseen war before the war. Let me take you back to the morning of August 12, 2024. The headlines were Venezuela mobilizes troops near Guyana border, Maduro threatens escalation over Essequibo dispute, U.S. warns of consequences for Venezuelan aggression. The official story was simple: another flare-up in a long-simmering territorial dispute, another case of a rogue regime flexing its muscles, another test of American resolve in its own backyard. The State Department issued a statement, the Pentagon repositioned a carrier strike group, and the media moved on to the next crisis. But here's what they didn't tell: this wasn't just another border skirmish. This was a coordinated strike, a calculated move in a much larger game, one that has been in motion for years, and one that could very well decide the future of American power in Latin America. I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of geopolitics, resource competition, and great power conflict. I've advised governments, briefed intelligence committees, and written more classified memos than I care to remember. And let me tell you, what's happening in Venezuela right now isn't just about oil, or territory, or even Maduro's survival. It's about the death of unipolarity, the rise of a new multipolar order, and the desperate last stand of an empire that refuses to accept its own decline. The mainstream narrative is a carefully constructed illusion, and if we don't see through it, we're walking blind into a storm we don't understand. So let's start with the story they want you to believe. The official: a rogue regime, a territorial dispute, and American resolve. On the surface, it's a straightforward tale. Venezuela, under Nicolas Maduro, has long claimed the Essequibo region, a 61,600 square mile territory controlled by Guyana but rich in oil, gold, and rare earth minerals. The dispute dates back to the 19th century, but it reignited in 2015 when ExxonMobil discovered massive offshore oil reserves in Guyana's waters. Since then, Maduro has periodically ratcheted up tensions, holding referendums, issuing decrees, and now, as of August, deploying troops to the border under the guise of defensive preparedness. The U.S. response has been equally predictable. The State Department condemned the move as provocative and destabilizing, while the Pentagon announced the deployment of the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group to the Caribbean, ostensibly for routine exercises. Secretary of State Antony Blinken called his Guyanese counterpart to reaffirm America's ironclad commitment to Guyana's sovereignty. The media dutifully reported the escalation as another example of Maduro's erratic behavior, another test of American credibility in the Western Hemisphere. The numbers seem to support this narrative. Venezuela's economy is in shambles, GDP has contracted by 75% since 2013, inflation has hit 1 million%, and nearly 8 million people have fled the country. Maduro's approval rating hovers around 20%, and his government is propped up by a mix of repression, Russian mercenaries, and Chinese loans. Meanwhile, Guyana's economy is booming, growing at an astonishing 38% in 2023 thanks to its newfound oil wealth. The logic seems a desperate Maduro, facing domestic unrest and international isolation, is lashing out to distract from his failures and rally nationalist sentiment. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's too clean. It ignores the timing, the coordination, and the deeper geopolitical currents at play. And if we accept it at face value, we're missing the real story. The hidden facts behind the coordinated strike. Let's start with the timing. August 12 wasn't chosen at random. 3 days earlier, on August 9, the U.S. Southern Command quietly began Operation Southern Shield, a series of joint military exercises with Guyana, Brazil, and Colombia. The drills, which included live-fire training and amphibious landings, were framed as routine, but their scale and location told a different story. They were the largest U.S. military maneuvers in South America in over a decade, and they were directly adjacent to Venezuela's eastern border. Now, Maduro isn't stupid. He knows that any military action against Guyana would trigger a U.S. response. So why provoke Washington at the exact moment it's conducting war games on his doorstep? The answer lies in the second piece of the coordination. For months, I've been tracking a series of high-level meetings between Venezuelan officials and their counterparts in Moscow and Beijing. In June, Maduro's defense minister, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, made an unannounced trip to Moscow, where he met with Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. The official readout was vague of bilateral defense cooperation, but sources inside the Kremlin told me the real topic was contingency planning. Then, in July, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi visited Caracas, where he signed a series of agreements, including a $5 billion line of credit for Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA. The timing of these meetings wasn't coincidental. They were preparatory. Here's what's really Venezuela's coordinated strike isn't just about Essequibo. It's a test, a probe to see how far the US is willing to go to defend Guyana, and how quickly Russia and China can respond. The data doesn't support the idea that Maduro is acting alone. Satellite imagery from August 10 shows a sudden surge in Russian military transport flights into Venezuela, including the delivery of S-300 air defense systems and Kilo-class submarines. Meanwhile, Chinese state-owned firms have been quietly buying up Venezuelan debt at pennies on the dollar, positioning themselves to take control of PDVSA's assets if the regime collapses. But the most telling detail? The language of the escalation. When Maduro announced the troop deployments, he didn't just threaten Guyana. He framed it as a defense of our sovereignty against imperialist aggression. That's not just rhetoric, it's signaling. He's positioning Venezuela as a frontline state in the new Cold War, a proxy for Russia and China in America's backyard. And the US is playing right into his hands. The X did geopolitical a new Cold War in America's backyard. To understand what's really at stake here, we need to out. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader struggle for global dominance between the US, Russia, and China, a struggle that has been building for years but is now reaching a critical inflection point. Let's start with the big picture. The post-Cold War unipolar moment, the period when the US was the sole superpower, is over. Russia and China have spent the last 2 decades systematically undermining American hegemony, and they're now in a position to challenge it directly. The war in Ukraine was the first major test of this new multipolar order. The US and its allies poured billions into supporting Kyiv, but the result has been a stalemate, with Russia consolidating its gains and China deepening its economic ties with Moscow. The lesson? The West can no longer impose its will unilaterally. Now, that struggle is coming to Latin America. For decades, the US treated the region as its exclusive sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine, the Cold War interventions, the war on drugs all were predicated on the idea that Washington could dictate the terms of engagement. But that era is ending. Russia and China have spent the last 20 years cultivating allies in the region, and Venezuela is their crown jewel. Consider the Russia has been Venezuela's primary military patron since the early 2000s, supplying everything from fighter jets to cyber warfare capabilities. In 2019, Moscow sent 2 nuclear-capable Tu-160 bombers to Venezuela in a show of force. In 2023, it deployed Wagner Group mercenaries to train Maduro's elite forces. China has become Venezuela's largest creditor, with over $60 billion in loans secured by oil shipments. It's also the country's top trading partner, buying nearly half of Venezuela's crude exports. And in 2024, Beijing began construction on a deepwater port in Venezuela's Paraguana Peninsula, a project that, when completed, will give China a permanent naval presence in the Caribbean. This isn't just economic engagement. It's strategic encirclement. And the US has been slow to recognize the threat. Now, let's talk about the hypocrisy. The US has spent the last 2 decades lecturing the world about the importance of sovereignty and territorial integrity. But when it comes to Latin America, those principles suddenly become flexible. The US has a long history of intervening in the region, from the Bay of Pigs to the coup in Chile to the invasion of AMA. And now, when Russia and China do the same thing, Washington acts shocked. The double standard is glaring. But here's where it gets interesting. The US isn't just facing a challenge from Russia and China. It's facing a coordinated challenge. Moscow and Beijing have spent the last decade aligning their strategies in the global south, and Venezuela is the perfect test case for their partnership. Russia provides the military muscle, China provides the economic lifeline, and together, they're creating a model for how to counter American power in the 21st century. And the US? It's still operating under the assumption that it can dictate the terms of engagement. That's a dangerous delusion. Military and strategic, the illusion of quick and easy. Let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where things get really dangerous. The US has a long history of underestimating its adversaries, and Venezuela is no exception. The Pentagon's playbook is to deploy a carrier strike group, issue stern warnings, and assume the other side will back down. But this isn't Iraq in 2003. Venezuela isn't a weak state with a hollow military. It's a fortified state, backed by two nuclear-armed powers, with a battle-hardened military and a population that, despite its suffering, still harbors deep anti-American sentiment. First, let's look at the capabilities. Venezuela's military is one of the most well-equipped in Latin America, thanks to decades of Russian arms sales. Its RS-300 and Buk-M2 missile systems, capable of shooting down U.S. aircraft. Naval Kilo-class submarines, which can threaten U.S. carrier groups. Cyber Russian-trained units capable of disrupting U.S. communications. Asymmetric, a network of pro-government militias, trained by Iranian Quds Force operatives. Then there's the geography. Venezuela is not a flat desert where U.S. airpower can dominate. It's a mountainous, jungle-covered country with a long coastline, perfect for guerrilla warfare. And let's not forget the human factor. Maduro's regime has spent years purging the military of disloyal officers, replacing them with hardliners who have everything to lose if the government falls. These aren't conscripts who will surrender at the first sign of trouble. These are true believers. Now, let's talk about the escalation ladder. The U.S. has a few options, none of them. 1. Economic. The U.S. has already imposed crippling sanctions on Venezuela, but they've only strengthened Maduro's grip on power. Further sanctions would hurt the Venezuelan people more than the regime. 2. Limited. The U.S. could conduct airstrikes against Venezuelan military targets, but this would risk Russian and Chinese retaliation. Remember, Moscow has already warned that any attack on Venezuela would be considered an attack on Russia. 3. Regime. The U.S. could attempt to overthrow Maduro, but this would require a full-scale invasion, and we've seen how that worked in Iraq and Afghanistan. Venezuela is not a failed state. It's a fortified state, and the cost of taking it would be astronomical. The hawks in Washington will tell you that a quick, decisive strike would solve the problem. But they're wrong. The lesson of the last 20 years is that there are no quick, decisive strikes in the 21st century. Every intervention creates unintended consequences, and every victory sows the seeds of the next conflict. And here's the Russia and China know this. They're not looking for a direct confrontation with the U.S. They're looking to bleed the U.S., to force it into a series of unwinnable conflicts that drain its resources and erode its global standing. Venezuela is just the first domino. The domestic political why this matters in an election year. Now, let's talk about the domestic politics, because this is where things get really messy. The U.S. is in the middle of a presidential election, and foreign policy is suddenly front and center. The Biden administration is under pressure from both the left wants diplomacy, the right wants confrontation, and the swing states, particularly Florida, are demanding action. Let's start with Florida. The state has a large Venezuelan exile community, many of whom fled Maduro's regime. They're a powerful voting bloc, and they're furious at the Biden administration's perceived weakness. In 2020, Trump won Florida by just 371,000 votes. The Venezuelan vote could be the difference in 2024. Then there's the optics. The Biden administration has spent the last 3 years trying to distance itself from the forever wars of the past. But now, it's being pulled into a new conflict, one that could define its legacy. The White House is caught between a rock and a hard do-nothing, and risk looking weak, act decisively, and risk another quagmire. And let's not forget the personalities involved. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has been pushing for a more aggressive stance, arguing that the U.S. can't afford to show weakness in the face of Russian and Chinese action. Secretary of State Blinken, meanwhile, is more cautious, warning that any military action could backfire. The tension between them is real, and it's shaping the administration's response. But here's this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader struggle for control of the Democratic Party. The progressive wing, led by figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is pushing for a diplomatic solution. The establishment, led by Biden and Blinken, is torn between intervention and restraint and the Republicans. They're salivating at the chance to paint Biden as weak on national security. The result? A muddled policy, one that sends mixed signals to allies and adversaries alike. And in geopolitics, mixed signals are dangerous. Scenario: the road ahead. So where do we go from here? Let's look at the three most likely scenarios, along with their probabilities. Scenario 1: the diplomatic off-ramp. In this scenario, the US and Venezuela reach a negotiated settlement, likely brokered by a third party like Brazil or Mexico. The deal would involve a temporary freeze on military deployments, a commitment from Venezuela to respect Guyana's sovereignty, and a promise from the US to ease sanctions in exchange for political reforms. Russia and China would tacitly support the deal, seeing it as a way to avoid a direct confrontation with the US. This is the best-case scenario, but it's far from ideal. It would require Maduro to back down, a move that would weaken his domestic standing. It would also require the US to make concessions, which would be politically unpopular. And even if a deal is reached, it would only be a temporary fix. The underlying tensions would remain. Scenario 2: the proxy war. This is the most likely scenario. The US increases its military support for Guyana, while Russia and China deepen their involvement in Venezuela. The conflict escalates into a proxy war, with the US providing weapons and intelligence to Guyana, and Russia and China doing the same for Venezuela. The fighting remains limited, but the risk of miscalculation is high. This scenario would be a disaster for the region. It would destabilize South America, trigger a new wave of refugees, and create a permanent flashpoint for great power competition. It would also force the US to choose between escalation and retreat, a choice that would have global implications. Scenario 3: the direct confrontation. This is the worst-case scenario. A Venezuelan attack on Guyana triggers a US military response, leading to a direct confrontation between the US and Venezuela. Russia and China condemn the US but stop short of direct intervention. The conflict escalates into a regional war, with Colombia, Brazil, and other Latin American countries forced to pick sides. This scenario would be a catastrophe. It would mark the first direct military conflict between the US and a Russian-backed state since the Cold War. It would also risk a broader war, with China potentially opening a second front in the South China Sea. And it would accelerate the decline of American power, proving that the US is no longer capable of unilaterally enforcing its will. None of these scenarios are good. But the most likely one, the proxy war, is also the most dangerous, because it creates a permanent state of tension, one that could easily spiral out of control. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. Let's take a step back and ask the big why is this happening? The answer lies in the broader failure of American grand strategy. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under the assumption of liberal hegemony, the idea that it can and should shape the world in its own image. This strategy has led to a series of disastrous interventions, from Iraq to Libya to Afghanistan. And yet, the US keeps doubling down, refusing to accept that its power is waning. The problem isn't just that the US is overextended. It's that its strategy is fundamentally flawed. The US assumes that it can impose its will through military force, economic sanctions, and diplomatic pressure. But in a world where power is diffusing and alliances are shifting, that approach is no longer sustainable. The Venezuela-Guyana crisis is just the latest symptom of this deeper malaise. It's not about oil, or democracy, or even Maduro's survival, it's about the unraveling of an entire geopolitical order. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a Latin American problem. It's a global one. The US has spent decades treating the Western Hemisphere as its backyard, a place where it could intervene at will without consequence. But that assumption is collapsing. Russia and China see Latin America as a critical theater in their challenge to American dominance, and they're playing the long game. Moscow's military cooperation with Venezuela, including the deployment of nuclear-capable bombers in 2013 and 2018, the sale of S-300 air defense systems, and the recent arrival of Wagner Group operatives isn't just about propping up Maduro. It's about creating a forward operating base for Russian power projection in the Americas. Beijing, meanwhile, has turned Venezuela into a test case for its debt trap diplomacy, with over $60 billion in loans since 2007, much of it secured against oil exports. When Maduro inevitably defaults, China won't just walk away, it will demand strategic assets, like port access or control over critical infrastructure, turning Venezuela into a de facto client state. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has no coherent strategy to counter this. The Biden administration's approach, sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and occasional saber-rattling, is the same playbook that failed in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Iran. It assumes that economic pain will eventually force Maduro to capitulate, but that ignores two key realities. First, authoritarian regimes don't collapse under pressure, they adapt. Maduro has survived hyperinflation, mass protests, and even a US-backed coup attempt in 2019. He's not going anywhere. Second, sanctions only work if they're universally enforced. But Russia and China have made it clear they won't comply. In fact, they're actively undermining them. In 2020, Russia sent a flotilla of oil tankers to Venezuela to bypass US sanctions, and China has continued to buy Venezuelan oil through shadowy middlemen. The US can't starve Maduro out if his patrons are feeding him. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela. The crisis is a microcosm of a larger shift in global power dynamics. For decades, the US has relied on its military and economic dominance to enforce its vision of the international order. But that dominance is eroding. The US share of global GDP has fallen from 35% in 1990 to 24% today. Its military, while still the most powerful in the world, is stretched thin by commitments in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. And its alliances are fraying. NATO is divided over Ukraine, the Middle East is a powder keg, and in Latin America, even traditionally US allies like Colombia and Brazil are hedging their bets. Brazil's Lula, for instance, has refused to condemn Maduro's aggression, instead calling for a negotiated solution. That's not neutrality, it's a calculated move to position Brazil as a regional power broker, independent of Washington. The military implications of this are profound. If Venezuela does invade Guyana, the US will face an impossible choice. Does it intervene directly, risking a wider war with Russia and China? Or does it stand aside, ceding the initiative to its adversaries? The Pentagon has been preparing for this scenario for years. In 2021, U.S. Southern Command conducted a series of wargames simulating a Venezuelan attack on Guyana, with U.S. forces deploying to the region to deter further aggression. But those exercises assumed a limited conflict, not a full-scale war. The reality is that any U.S. intervention would be messy, costly, and politically fraught. The American public has no appetite for another foreign war, and Congress is deeply divided over military spending. Meanwhile, Russia and China would use the conflict to justify their own military buildups, accelerating the global arms race. Here's the US isn't just losing in Venezuela. It's losing everywhere. In the Middle East, Iran is extending its influence through proxies in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. In Africa, Wagner Group mercenaries are propping up dictators and exploiting mineral resources. In Asia, China is militarizing the South China Sea and preparing for a potential invasion of Taiwan. The US is still the world's preeminent power, but it's no longer the only one. And in a multipolar world, the rules of the game have changed. The establishment narrative in Washington is that the US can still shape the world in its image if it just tries harder. But that's a fantasy. The era of liberal hegemony is over. The question now is whether the US can adapt to a world where it must compete, rather than dominate. That means accepting that some conflicts, like Venezuela's, can't be resolved on American terms. It means rebuilding alliances, not just demanding loyalty. And it means recognizing that military power alone won't secure US interests, it must be paired with economic statecraft, diplomacy, and a willingness to engage with adversaries when necessary. The Venezuela-Guyana crisis is a warning. If the US doesn't change course, it will keep stumbling into conflicts it can't win, with allies it can't rely on, and adversaries it can't deter. The alternative isn't isolationism, it's a smarter, more sustainable grand strategy. But that requires something Washington has struggled with in recent: humility. The world is no longer waiting for America to lead. It's moving on, with or without us. The question is whether we'll be part of the future, or just a footnote in it. Now, what most people don't realize is that the Venezuela-Guyana crisis isn't just a foreign policy headache for Washington, it's a domestic political time bomb for Caracas. And if you think Maduro's regime is stable, you haven't been paying attention to the cracks forming beneath the surface. The coordinated strike we're seeing isn't just about oil or territory, it's about survival. Maduro's government is playing a high-stakes game of distraction, and the question is whether it will work or if it will backfire spectacularly. Let me explain why this matters. Venezuela's economy is a zombie, kept alive by a combination of Russian loans, Chinese debt restructuring, and the occasional lifeline from Iran. The IMF estimates that GDP has contracted by 75% since 2013, inflation hit 280% in 2023, and over 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country. That's more than the population of Denmark. But here's the uncomfortable: the regime isn't collapsing because it's too weak, it's collapsing because it's too strong. It has crushed dissent, co-opted the military, and turned the state into a predatory machine that feeds on what's left of the economy. The problem isn't that Maduro can't govern, it's that he can't govern well. And that's a distinction Washington keeps missing. The coordinated strike, military exercises, border provocations, the sudden revival of the Essequibo claim isn't just about Guyana. It's about domestic control. Maduro needs a crisis to justify his grip on power, and what better way than to manufacture an external threat? It's a page straight out of The Authoritarian. When the economy is in freefall and your people are starving, you rally them around a flag. The problem is, this time, the flag might not be enough. Here's where it gets interesting. The Venezuelan military, long the backbone of the regime, is showing signs of fracture. In 2023, there were at least 3 reported coup attempts, including one in April involving high-ranking officers from the Strategic Operational Command. The U.S. Treasury even sanctioned General Gustavo González López, the head of the Intelligence Directorate, for his role in suppressing dissent. Now, I'm not saying the military is about to turn on Maduro. Loyalty is bought with oil contracts, drug trafficking routes, and immunity from prosecution, but the fact that we're even hearing about these plots tells you something. The generals aren't monolithic. Some are true believers, others are opportunists, and a few are just biding their time. Then there's the opposition. Maria Corina Machado, the opposition leader who won the primary in October 2023 with 92% of the vote, is still barred from running in the 2024 presidential election. The regime has disqualified her, arrested her allies, and even raided the offices of her party. But here's the: Machado isn't going away. She's touring the country, holding rallies, and building a movement that's as much about civil resistance as it is about electoral politics. The regime can ban her from the ballot, but it can't ban her from the streets. And that's the wild card. Now, let's talk about the 2024 election. Maduro has already signaled he'll run again, but the question is whether the vote will be free, fair, or even credible. The last time Venezuela held a presidential election, in 2018, the opposition boycotted, turnout was abysmal, and the result was widely dismissed as a sham. This time, the regime is under pressure from the US, from the EU, from its own people, to at least appear legitimate. But here's the: if Maduro allows a semi-competitive election, he risks losing. If he rigs it too obviously, he risks a backlash. And if he cancels it altogether, he risks international isolation and even military intervention from neighbors like Brazil or Colombia. So what's the most likely scenario? I'd bet on a controlled election, one where Maduro wins, but not by enough to trigger mass protests. He'll allow a few opposition candidates to run, maybe even let Machado's allies participate in some way, but he'll stack the deck with voter intimidation, media censorship, and good old-fashioned fraud. The goal isn't to convince the world that the election is fair, it's to convince enough Venezuelans that resistance is futile. And if that fails? Well, that's where the Guyana crisis comes in. Imagine Maduro loses the election, or at least, the opposition claims he did. Protests erupt in Caracas, Maracaibo, Valencia. The military is divided. Some units defect, others open fire. And then, just as the country teeters on the brink of civil war, Maduro declares a state of emergency. He blames the unrest on foreign interference and Guyanese aggression. He mobilizes the military, not to invade Guyana, but to crush dissent at home. The international community condemns him, the US imposes more sanctions, but the regime survives, because in the end, survival is all that matters. But here's the thing about it's not the same as stability. Venezuela under Maduro isn't a functioning state, it's a kleptocracy with a flag. The oil industry is a shadow of what it once was. PDVSA, the state oil company, is producing less than 800,000 barrels a day, down from 3.5 million in 1998. The refineries are falling apart, the workers are fleeing, and the only thing keeping the lights on is the occasional shipment of Iranian condensate. The regime can print money, but it can't print food. It can jail dissidents, but it can't jail hunger. And that's the Achilles heel. Now, let's talk about the endgame. There are 3 possible scenarios here, and none of them are pretty. First, the regime collapses. This is the scenario Washington keeps hoping for, but it's the least likely. Maduro has survived sanctions, protests, coup attempts, and even a US-backed interim government. He's not going down without a fight, and he's got the military, the colectivos, and foreign backers like Russia and China to keep him afloat. If the regime does fall, it won't be because of US pressure, it'll be because the military turns on him, or because the economy implodes so completely that even his inner circle realizes they're better off cutting a deal. Second, the regime survives but becomes a pariah state. This is the most likely outcome. Maduro holds on to power, but Venezuela becomes a failed state in all but name. The economy continues to shrink, the brain drain accelerates, and the country becomes a hub for drug trafficking, money laundering, and Russian mercenaries. The US and Europe impose more sanctions, but they don't work because the regime doesn't need the global economy, it just needs enough oil revenue to keep the generals happy. In this scenario, Venezuela becomes a permanent crisis, a black hole in the Western Hemisphere that sucks in resources and attention without ever resolving. Third, the regime transitions, but not the way the US wants. This is the scenario no one in Washington is talking about, but it's the one that keeps me up at night. What if Maduro cuts a deal with the opposition? Not a democratic transition, but a power-sharing arrangement where the military keeps control, the opposition gets a few ministries, and the US lifts sanctions in exchange for stability. It's not democracy, but it's not dictatorship either. It's a managed decline, a slow-motion collapse where the regime trades some power for survival. And the worst part? It might be the best option available. Here's why this matters for the US. The establishment narrative in Washington is that Venezuela is a problem to be solved either through regime change or through containment. But what if it's neither? What if Venezuela is a symptom of a larger shift in global power, one where the US no longer gets to dictate outcomes? The truth is, the US doesn't have a Venezuela policy, it has a Venezuela posture. It imposes sanctions, it condemns the regime, it supports the opposition, but it doesn't have a strategy for what comes in, and that's the real danger. Because here's the thing about failed, they don't stay contained. Venezuela's collapse isn't just a humanitarian disaster, it's a geopolitical one. It's a refugee crisis that's destabilizing Colombia and Brazil. It's a drug trafficking hub that's fueling the opioid epidemic in the US. It's a Russian and Chinese foothold in America's backyard. And it's a warning of what happens when a country's institutions rot from within. So what should the US do? First, stop pretending that sanctions alone will work. They haven't for the past decade, and they won't now. Second, recognize that the opposition isn't a monolith, some want democracy, others want power, and a few just want to get rich. Third, engage with the military. Not to stage a coup, but to offer a way out for the generals who know the regime is unsustainable. And fourth, prepare for the long game. Venezuela isn't going to be fixed in a year, or even a decade. The best the US can do is manage the fallout, contain the damage, and hope that one day, the Venezuelan people get the government they deserve. But here's the uncomfortable: that day might not come anytime soon. And in the meantime, the world will keep moving on with or without us. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the death of the Monroe Doctrine in slow motion. The idea that the Western Hemisphere is America's exclusive sphere of influence has been dying for decades, but Venezuela is where the corpse finally stops twitching. The Russians are there, the Chinese are there, the Iranians are there, and none of them are leaving because we told them to. In 2019, when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president with U.S. backing, Moscow didn't just condemn the move, it sent in military advisors and Wagner Group operatives to prop up Maduro. Beijing, meanwhile, has quietly turned Venezuela into a testing ground for its debt trap diplomacy, swapping oil for infrastructure projects that will never be completed but will keep Caracas on the hook for generations. The Iranians? They're running drones and missile technology through Venezuela to bypass U.S. sanctions, turning the country into a forward operating base for Tehran's proxy networks. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. has no answer to this because the tools it's always relied on, military intervention, economic coercion, diplomatic isolation, are either too blunt or too weak. The last time the U.S. tried regime change in Latin America, it was 1989 in AMA, and even that was a surgical strike compared to what would be needed in Venezuela. Today, the Pentagon's own wargames suggest that any military action would trigger a protracted insurgency, a refugee exodus that would dwarf Syria's, and a regional war with Colombia and Brazil caught in the crossfire. And let's be honest, after Iraq and Afghanistan, the American public has zero appetite for another forever war, especially one in a country most people couldn't find on a map. So if military force is off the table, and sanctions have failed, what's left? The establishment answer is always the more of the same, but louder. More sanctions, more condemnations, more support for the opposition. But here's the problem: the opposition is fractured, corrupt, and increasingly irrelevant. Guaidó's moment has passed, and the new generation of opposition leaders are either in exile or in prison. The ones still in Venezuela are either co-opted by the regime or so radicalized that they become useless as negotiating partners. The U.S. keeps betting on the same losing horse because it's the only horse it knows. But in a race where the finish line keeps moving, you don't win by running faster, you win by changing the game. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela. What's happening there is a case study in how great powers decline, not with a bang, but with a whimper. The U.S. still has the world's largest economy and the most powerful military, but it's losing the ability to shape outcomes in its own neighborhood. That's not just a Venezuela problem, it's a global one. If the U.S. can't manage a crisis 1,500 miles from Miami, what does that say about its ability to handle Taiwan, or Ukraine, or the South China Sea? The answer is that it says a lot, and none of it is good. So what's the alternative? First, the U.S. needs to accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere, at least not in the short term. That doesn't mean legitimizing his regime, it means recognizing reality. The second step is to stop treating Venezuela as a zero-sum game. The U.S. has spent years trying to isolate the country, but the rest of the world hasn't played along. The EU, India, and even some of Venezuela's neighbors have been quietly re-engaging with Caracas because they need the oil. The U.S. should do the same, but on its own terms. That means lifting some sanctions, not all, but enough to create leverage in exchange for the release of political prisoners, free and fair elections, and an end to Russian and Iranian military presence. It's not ideal, but it's better than the current stalemate. Third, the U.S. needs to stop outsourcing its Venezuela policy to Colombia and Brazil. Both countries have their own interests, and neither is aligned with Washington's. Colombia's President Petro is a leftist who sees Maduro as a brother in arms, not a pariah. Brazil's Lula is playing a double game, condemning the regime in public while cutting deals with it in private. The U.S. can't afford to let its Venezuela policy be held hostage by the whims of its neighbors. It needs to lead, not follow. Finally, the U.S. needs to prepare for the worst. Venezuela's collapse isn't a question of if, it's a question of when. The country's oil production has fallen from 3.5 million barrels a day in 1998 to less than 700,000 today. The electrical grid is on the verge of total failure. The currency is worthless. And the military, which has been the regime's last line of defense, is starting to fracture. When the dam breaks, and it will, the U.S. needs to be ready to contain the fallout. That means working with Colombia and Brazil to prepare for a refugee crisis, coordinating with allies to intercept drug shipments, and ensuring that Russia and China don't turn Venezuela into a permanent military outpost. But here's the thing about grand strategy: it's not about winning. It's about not losing. The U.S. isn't going to fix Venezuela, any more than it fixed Afghanistan or Iraq. The best it can do is manage the decline, limit the damage, and hope that one day, the Venezuelan people get the chance to rebuild. That's not a satisfying answer, but it's the only one that makes sense. And that, in the end, is the real lesson of Venezuela. The world is moving into an era where the US is no longer the sole superpower, where its enemies are no longer just states but networks, where its tools are no longer as effective as they once were. Venezuela is a warning, but it's also a test. The question isn't whether the US can turn back the clock, it's whether it can adapt before it's too late. And right now, the clock is ticking.